Today we have Shuhas Arehalli. Is that am I pronouncing it correctly?
Perfect.
Yeah, he's a newcomer to the group, so everyone let's welcome him. Do you want to introduce yourself before you begin?
Yeah, so I'm Suas Arehalli. I am a new professor of computer science at Macalester College, just closing out my first year in this new professorial role. Before that, I was a PhD student in cognitive science at Johns Hopkins University. And I tell you a little bit about what I work on, but that's what the rest of the talk is going to be about. So I'll leave you in suspense.
All right, thank you. Okay, then yeah, shall we begin?
Yeah, certainly. So I have this fancy title for this talk, evaluating quantitative theories in sentence processing, large-scale psycholinguistics, and computational modeling. This is just a very fancy way of tying together a couple of projects that I've worked on, both alone and with larger groups. And I really wanted to talk about all of them. So I'm going to be going through a kind of like marathon presentation. I have too many slides, but I'd be more than happy if you interrupted me, discussed any of the topics around. I just kind of want to give you an idea of the kind of work that I do and the kind of big pitch that I have for like one line of research in my research program. And so without any further ado, I want to give you a bit of an outline of all of the things that I want to try to get to. I have two sort of big themes. The first is talking about this idea of quantitative precision, both in data and in predictions made by theories. I'm going to walk through an example of that with a particular kind of psycholinguistic phenomenon. That is a phenomenon in the psychological processing of language, the space within most of my work lies. And I'm going to talk about a specific phenomenon called garden paths and a specific precise quantitative theory that other folks have come up with called surprisal theory, and work that me and a bunch of colleagues have worked on in order to make precise predictions about when and where this phenomenon should lie, as well as collecting data that is precise enough such that we can test that model against other models out there in the literature. And then if I have a little bit of time, I want to talk a little bit about how I'm moving that approach to working on another kind of psycholinguistic phenomenon that I've been very interested in, something called agreement attraction, and focus on how I can leverage sort of computational modeling, computer science side of my research, and able to collect lots of data that is specifically built to be easy to model given the constraints of some of the computational models that I work with. But again, more little intro stuff. Before I get into that, I want to give you sort of the broad pitch of what the themes running across all of these projects are. I work in psycholinguistics. I'm interested in trying to build theories about why people process sentences the way they do, why they have difficulty in some sentences versus other. My pitch begins by saying that that computational implementations of these theories, building a computational model that implements whatever mechanisms the theory proposes, allows us to make more precise predictions versus just the sort of standard verbal theories that have been made in the field for quite a long time. Specifically, I'm interested in their ability to predict the magnitude of certain effects that we observe, rather than sort of the traditional way of verbal theory building, where we just predict that an effect exists in a particular direction in a particular experiment. These precise predictions are important to me because they allow us to disentangle theories that are superficially similar. For a lot of the phenomena I'm going to talk about, there's a common problem that many theories are able to get the right directional predictions for all of the data that's around. And so by allowing us to use the magnitude of effects that we observe, we get another dimension along which we can separate out which theories actually predict the data and which ones don't. But this comes with a little bit of a problem, which is that testing those very precise predictions that these computational models makes requires very precise human data. If we have big error bars around our human observations, then a lot of different theories are going to fit within those confidence intervals. And so in order to test these precise predictions, we need precise human data, which means large-scale data collection, this large-scale psycholinguistics pitch. And I should probably specify what kind of data am I collecting. I told you that I care about sentence processing, but because we're doing large-scale data collection, the kind of data that I collect needs to be something that can't just be done in the lab, but I can bring online to use the powers of Mechanical Turk and Prolific and all these online data collection platforms. And so the kind of data I collect is something called self-paced reading data. And if you're not familiar with what that is, I always love giving these little sort of semi-fake visual examples, because in reality, it is a self-paced reading paradigm, and you would be the one clicking the space bar and progressing the slide, but it is going to be presenter-paced reading in this example. The way that this works is I take a sentence and I present it to participants word by word, and they normally, me right now, will be hitting a space bar and moving it one by one through a sentence. So you see the suspect sent the file deserves further investigation. And you read this potentially a little tricky, a little complicated sentence word by word. And the particular sentence that I gave you here is the kind of sentence that I want to start investigating for the first part of this talk, a garden path sentence. And as you read this word by word, I paused a little bit because I got caught off guard by it too, even though I've been doing this for years. But once you get to the word deserved, you might have noticed that things get a little bit tricky. You read the sentence, the suspect sent the file. You might have predicted that the sentence might have ended right there because you formed a perfectly good sentence structure. But then the word deserved came in and made you realize that you had to do something else. And just like I slow down, participants tend to slow down at this particular position in the sentence. One thing that I do want to make clear, because sometimes I get tripped up, and oftentimes audience members get tripped up and believe that this isn't a legitimate sentence of English, that it is in fact what we call an ungrammatical sentence that doesn't have a proper structure and thus a proper meaning. But I'd like to convince you that this sentence means exactly the same thing as this other sentence, what we call the unreduced version of this sentence. The suspect that was sent the file deserved further investigation. And if you jump back to this sentence right here, you might see that this reduction is sort of clear reading this sentence as well. The suspect sent the file. The particular suspect who was sent the file deserved further investigation. And these kinds of reductions of the structure, called a reduced relative clause, actually show up all the time. Linguists have this very fun thing of like reading newspaper headlines where these appear most often and trying to see whether newspaper editors go too far and start reducing sentences in ways that are tricky, just like these here. But when I say that we slow down there, slowing is something that is relative. So there needs to be something to compare that slowness to. In what cases are you slow in contrast to particular cases in which you are fast? And so that unreduced version we'll be referring to as the unambiguous version of this sentence, in contrast to that original sentence, the ambiguous version of the garden path, is that comparison. That is deserved in the suspect sent the file, deserved further investigation, has deserved read slower than deserved in the suspect that was sent the file, deserved further investigation. And so the kinds of experiments I run are self-paced reading experiments where I measure the amount of time that people take to press the space bar so I can tell how slowly people read each individual word. And I show different participants both of these versions of the sentence. And then I compare the time that people take to read deserved in the ambiguous version and the unambiguous version. And that difference tells me if people slow down. The next question that we might ask, because I tell you I'm interested in sentence processing and psycholinguistics, I'm interested in why we slow down, how people process these sentences, why this sentence is particularly difficult. The most common pitch that people will give you is the same reason that I call these sentences ambiguous, that this beginning portion of the sentence, the suspect sent the file, can be read in two distinct ways. First, the way where this forms a perfectly legitimate sentence, the suspect sent the file. There's a sending event where the person who's doing the sending is the suspect and the thing sent is the file, versus a reading of the sentence. The reading of the sentence that you should eventually arrive at, where the suspect sent the file, is what we call a reduced relative clause. In this version of the sentence, we don't yet know who the sender is. We might never know who the sender is. But what we know is that the recipient of this sending event, the person who received the file, is the suspect, and the thing that's being sent is the file. We have these two disparate readings of the beginning of the sentence. And then when we get to the rest of the sentence, the word deserved disambiguates between these two versions of the sentence. Once you see the word deserved, then you have to adopt the subject reading of the beginning of the sentence. And the classical story around garden path sentences is that this first reading, the one with the one next to it, the sentence reading, is called a preferred reading. This is the one that we'd like to read the first time we go through the sentence, but then eventually we're disambiguated at the word deserved to this dispreferred reading. And when we're disambiguated to this dispreferred reading, that is what causes the slowdown. And the theories within the field try to explain this pattern of behavior, try to dig a little bit deeper into why exactly disambiguation to the dispreferred version of the sentence is so bad and slows us down so much. One very popular theory, an older theory in the literature, is what I'm going to refer to as a reanalysis style reading, which says that speakers are going to commit to this preferred parse when they read the beginning of the sentence. We don't even consider the second reading down here at the bottom. We fully commit to the first, and then we reach the word deserved, and we realize that that first reading is no longer consistent with the structure of our sentence. Because of that, then we have to engage in what we call a costly reanalysis process. We have to go back to earlier material in the sentence and come up with a new interpretation, i.e. the second interpretation down at the bottom, so that we can construct a fully legitimate parse of the full sentence. We have to go to reading 2 and spend a bunch of time going back in the sentence to reconstruct it. However, there's another theory that's gained popularity more recently, a sort of parallel processing, probabilistic sort of approach to understanding these sorts of garden path effects, which says that we don't actually commit to any particular reading at the beginning of the sentence. In fact, we process entirely in parallel. We keep both of these two interpretations in our head through the beginning of the sentence. The cost that we incur is the cost of disambiguation. That cost is just the cost of readjusting our probabilities within our mental representations. We have previously believed that even though we have both interpretations in our head, parse 1 is the better parse to have with high probability. We reach the word deserved, and we have to adjust our mental representations. So there's now a very low or no probability on interpretation 1, and shift all of that probability mass to interpretation 2. And here, preferred under this parallel processing theory is woven into this probabilistic model. The preferred parse is the parse that is most probable under some kind of probabilistic model of a language, which will come up later in a moment as this begins to connect more to NLP and the computational world. And both of these theories are instantiated more concretely within the literature, specifically on the topic of how we determine which parses are preferred. Reanalysis comes to conclusions about the structure of these sentences, syntactic parsing analyses of what sentence structures are involved. And these principles, Fraser and Rayner developed in 1982, late closure and minimal attachment are sort of a classical view of when you should pick one parse as preferred and one parse as dispreferred, whether they violate or obey these particular rules. In theory 2, parallel processing, things are made more concrete through the world of probabilities. You build a probabilistic model, and now you can start to empirically measure the probabilities associated with particular structures. in different iterations, different kinds of frequencies were used, structural frequencies in this Hale 2001 article. But more recently, people have been focusing on broad coverage predictability. How likely is the word deserved given prior context, what we call surprisal theory, which we'll be bringing up a little bit later, but want to preview now. And so given those theories, going back to this sort of experimental model that me and other folks use, we take these two sentences, we do our self-paced reading study, and I have these blue bars that represent the reading times that we observe at the word deserved. And under this model, what we expect is we see larger reading times at deserved in the ambiguous sentence up top, where we disambiguate to the dispreferred parse. And in the unambiguous sentences, we see much lower reading times, much lower time spent reading the word deserved. And it's important to observe that whether we use the principles of late closure and minimal attachment or these more frequency probability-based models, we get the same directional prediction here. In both of these cases, we can explain this pattern of results, because in both cases, the suspect sent the file deserved further investigation, disambiguates towards the dispreferred parse. And so this is the sort of coarse directional prediction that the sort of level of verbal theory that I've presented so far kind of predicts. And I know I said interrupt me at any time, but I want to take like a brief moment to pause, make sure that this stuff is clear, because it sort of lays the foundation for stuff that's going on. Good so far?
Perfect. I have a nerdy English professor question.
Perfect.
And it has to do with the unambiguous sentence with the suspect that was sent the file deserve further investigation. Syntactically, English has the relative pronoun who for people, the suspect who was sent the file. And I would be curious if a who, which indicates a person, that the person is being renamed, would be processed even more quickly than a suspect that. In other words, a who would be even more unambiguous.
So
I get that's not really part of your project, but I'm throwing that out there for your consideration.
Yeah, no, that is a very interesting and very cool observation. I've been like working on these sentences for quite a long while, and in different materials, we use both who and that in that spot in order to sort of construct these relative clauses. And in other sort of like fields within psycholinguistics, people talk about when you use words that are like more restrictive in the domains of things that are compatible with them, like who only selecting things that can be like agents, processing gets a little bit faster, but I've never thought about that question in terms of these relative clauses. Because I guess given the structure here, there's only really like one entity in the discourse that can really be referred to by that, given that you only have the suspect around it, the point of time that that shows up. But that does raise a very interesting like empirical question where I would agree that I think I'd predict that with who it might be read a little bit faster. It's easier to integrate into the context because you know that there's a person and that who must refer to that person. But yeah, that's a very good point. I've never thought about that. If I can find, we might be able to dig into the data we have to find empirical evidence of whether people do this faster with who's versus that's. But maybe I can check that quick at some point and maybe get back to you. Randy, question. Oh, sorry, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'll go ahead and ask a question I was going to say for later. You presented the reanalysis versus parallel interpretation as competing alternatives.
Yes.
But back in the 80s or 90s, Marcel Just presented some really compelling eye tracking data suggesting that there are individual differences there, that people with larger working memory capacities are able to maintain parallel interpretations, while those with lesser working memory capacities are forced to commit to an early interpretation. And so I just wondered if you had considered individual differences.
Yeah, so in the work that I'm going to present here, we've sort of like made a simplifying assumption that is certainly not true, that all speakers of the language adopt the exact same parsing strategy. But
And that's a
there
legitimate research strategy.
But yeah, there is, oh, I can't remember the authors of this paper off the top of my head, but there is a very fantastic paper that a couple of authors in Shravan Vashisht's lab, where they try to measure like individual differences across folks within their experiments through like this hierarchical Bayesian decision tree model, where they try to predict for every participant, given both of the data from the sort of like attention checks, comprehension questions, where we figure out whether people parse the sentence correctly, as well as the sort of timing data throughout the sentence, classifying participants into whether they have sort of like, the sort of distinction they were looking at is whether participants just sort of gave up on finding a correct parse of the sentence, whether they did something that looked like reanalysis, whether they sort of just sped through the entire sentence because they just wanted to get paid at the end of the experiment. I don't think they explicitly considered whether some people fit a more reanalysis profile versus a more parallel processing profile. Because I guess what I'm arguing here is through sort of normal experimental means, it's hard to differentiate empirically which person fits into which profile, which makes it hard. But I'm sure an approach like that could be used with our data later on to see if this sort of like distributional pattern sort of bears out. But yeah, fantastic observation. This is the kind of stuff that I hope like a little bit further down the line when this stuff gets more developed, we can really dig into and start looking at.
A question. Can you hear me?
There's a bit of an echo, it seems.
Yeah, Zay's working on it. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes.
How we're doing?
Sounds perfect.
Yep. Okay. I have worked with full texts and always wondered when one looks at just isolated sentences, how common it actually is that we get ambiguous, contextless sentences that need to be parsed just on their own. Do we have numbers just how often that even happens to normal language users, so that what we're testing, how often is that even required?
Yeah, so I don't know any data on that exact question. I imagine that one could probably go through like longer naturalistic texts and try to find like garden path-like constructions within them. They're relatively infrequent, but we know they show up. Again, like there's this very fun game of going through newspaper headlines and trying to find these ambiguities. But the thing that you're absolutely 100% right on is that a lot of the times, this kind of ambiguity is almost pre-disambiguated by context, where only one of these initial interpretations makes sense given the structure of the text. And when we communicate naturalistically, there might be a bias towards avoiding these kinds of ambiguous constructions because we like to be clear communicators and not leave people with ambiguities that are hard to disambiguate even without further context. At least for the kind of work that I'm doing, I guess my primary focus is trying to figure out what parsing mechanism exists in our heads that lets us deal with these circumstances, that if faced with these circumstances, we make certain commitments or we process in certain ways that lead to these slowdowns. And so I'm maybe a little bit less interested in how naturalistic these structures are for the kind of work that I'm doing. It's not the garden paths that are the focus, but the mechanism that leads us to struggle in these contextless situations.
Fair
But
enough.
there is quite a bit of work on garden paths that shows that like context does disambiguate and can lead people to not have this kind of difficulty.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Fair enough. Yep.
Perfect. Any other questions at this little stopping point? Okay, I'll move right along. And so now we get to the little bit of the transition, the little bit of the quantitative, large-scale psycholinguistics pitch that me and a bunch of colleagues are making, which is that we want to move from just looking at these two conditions and saying that the unambiguous case is faster than the ambiguous case, and start asking, how much do we slow down? How much faster are we when our sentence disambiguates for us? Now, in order to do that, my pitch is that we need two different things. We need quantitatively precise theories and quantitatively precise data in order to match with it. I've realized that I might have, oh, it's just a bolding. I thought I'd spelled quantitatively wrong on my slide. Perfect. So what are the quantitatively precise theories that we have that actually make predictions on exactly how much we should slow down? Well, it turns out, going back to this slide, this predictability theory that was sort of developed out of Hale 2001 and sort of found its own in this Levy 2008 article, what I'll call surprisal theory, that is based around the idea of the predictability of upcoming words, actually provides us with a fairly quantitatively precise specification of what these sort of garden path effects, these slowdowns, should look like. And that claim, if we take a very strong committal version of this theory, is that the difficulty at any word is proportional to the surprisal at that word. Where surprisal here is defined information theoretically. For those of you who work in NLP on language models or anything of that sort, this is a quantity that's probably familiar to you, the negative log probability of a word given its prior context. And note that here, I'm not making any particular claim about garden paths. In fact, surprisal theory is a theory about difficulty in processing language broadly. Difficulty at any word in any sentence should be proportional to this quantity. Everything is caught up in what they call the surprisal bottleneck, this probability distribution that we take the negative log probability of. Everything that makes the sentence difficult can be captured by predictability in some sort of mental model of next words that our brains develop. And if we take this theory at face value, this tells us that we should be able to estimate the exact magnitude of garden path effects. That is, this exact difference between these two bars, using some estimate of surprisal that we could pull straight from a neural language model. Because that probability distribution, the next word given previous words, is exactly the specification of the language modeling task within natural language processing. And this is where we get this nice convergence between NLP and computational psycholinguistics that I sort of get to take advantage of as a computer science professor, and get to take my computer science money and spend it on doing psycholinguistics. And so now I get to transition into the first thing that I am actually involved in, which is this large data set that a number of colleagues and I have constructed that we call the syntactic ambiguity processing benchmark. This is a data set which contains word-by-word reading times for 2,000 participants in a self-paced reading task, exactly like the ones that I described. And that 2,000 is sort of the big investment that took quite a bit of money and quite a bit of time on Prolific, which meant that we spent a lot of time collecting exactly the right kinds of sentences that we wanted to run through. So in addition to the kinds of garden path sentences that I've presented to you so far, we test 3 different variants of garden path sentences, the ones that I've shown you called MVRR garden paths that I'll focus on for the rest of this talk, as well as 2 other kinds of garden path ambiguities, as well as a bunch of other syntactically ambiguous sentences. So as long as we have 2,000 eyes and space bars on this data, we collect quite a bit of it on a variety of different syntactic ambiguities. Along with that, we also have our filler items, unrelated sentences that we collect data on, that'll also be useful to us to calibrate our models, take advantage of the fact that surprisal defines its proportionality for every word in every sentence that we present to participants. And this benchmark was designed specifically in order to facilitate this quantitative modeling of these sorts of psycholinguistic effects. We collect data from 2,000 participants so we can get our error bars very small and have very precise quantitative data to correspond to those quantitative theories. But before I get even more into the syntactic ambiguity benchmark, I do want to mention this is not a project that I worked on alone. In fact, I was only a small part of this project. So I want to talk about all of my wonderful colleagues who worked on it as well. Here is the group of them at the Society for Human Sentence Processing Conference in 2023. At the party, I unfortunately was sleeping in my hotel room, so they have photoshopped me in the top right corner, as well as our colleague Christian Mujica, who was not able to attend. I want to draw attention to Grusha Prasad right at the left, Mari Kugamoto right after. At the center, Quanzheng Huang, who was the lead author on this paper and really led the entire project, as well as their two PIs, Brian Dillon and then Tal Linzen on the very far right. So with all of the people, all of the structure of the data set, we also want to add in this quantitative modeling portion. So we take all of the stimuli that we've shown to these 2,000 participants, and we feed them into a neural language model. In fact, two different neural language models, an LSTM trained on a bunch of Wikipedia data, as well as a GPT-2 in the line of GPTs that eventually lead to ChatGPT, but much smaller and something that OpenAI was kind enough to let us deal with in its full model glory and not make us use online APIs to deal with. And so we get surprisals for every word in all of our critical stimuli. And then we run those models on the exact same filler items that participants saw. Those are not our critical items. These are not the kinds of data that I'm going to be showing you. And the reason that we do this is to find a conversion model. Surprisal theory tells us about proportionality between reading times and surprisals. So what we do is we find that constant of proportion, whatever multiplier we need to turn surprisals into predicted reading times. I say proportions here, but in actuality, it's a little bit more complicated. We have to control for a bunch of different factors that aren't as interesting to us. The frequencies of words and lengths of words, which have to do with the speed of visual word recognition that we need to regress out. But once all of that is done, we get what we call theory-based predicted reading times. We get actual estimates for what we predict reading time should be under surprisal theory, assuming that these neural language models are models of predictability that apply to humans. And then what we do is we fit some Bayesian regression models in order to estimate effect sizes from each of these sets of data. And then what I'm going to be showing you is the estimated effect size due to the effect of ambiguity. How much of the slowdown that we see should be attributed to the fact that I showed you an ambiguous sentence versus an unambiguous sentence. And this is what we are going to be calling our garden path effect. So far, so good on all of the methodology involved here. Perfect. And so here are all of the sorts of cool, interesting garden path sentences, object relative clauses, high and low attachments for attachment ambiguity, some subject-verb agreement stuff down at the bottom. I'm not going to be talking about all of those. I'm going to be talking about these three kinds of garden path sentences with their ambiguous and unambiguous pairs. And in fact, I'm only going to really be focusing on those top two sentences, the main verb and reduced relative clause garden path sentences of the same structure that I've shown you so far. The girl who fed the lamb remained relatively calm, as opposed to the girl who was fed the lamb remained relatively calm. And so from all of that data, we get all of our predictions. We get a plot like this. I'm going to chop off everything that's not a garden path sentence. But even with all of that extra data, you can probably see that one of these sets of dots is very different than the rest of the sets of dots. So the dots in the red circle right there with their error bars are our empirical observations, the estimated effects we got from our human subjects. And those dots at the very bottom are our model predictions. Now, those yellow dots on the very left of every one of these kinds of garden path sentences, those we really shouldn't worry about. Those are baselines that don't involve any of the factors from surprisal theory at all. This is if we only predict that the differences are due to the differences in the lengths of the sentence, the differences in frequencies of previous words, and so on, spilling over to our current word. But those blue and red dots are the predicted effects coming out from two different kinds of language models. The blue from our LSTMs trained on Wikipedia, and the red from GPT-2. And you can see that they are orders of magnitude smaller than the empirical effects. And so the conclusion that we had coming out of this paper is that surprisal theory can't quite account for the magnitude of the effect, even though, as we can see, all of these predictions are on the right side of that zero line. They all predict positive effects, slowdowns in our data. But once we move into the space of magnitudes rather than direction, we see that those very significant positive slowdown effects are very, very small compared to the empirical effects that we observe, which we can pose as a criticism of surprisal theory. But now I'm going to move on to another project that I worked on, which relies on the idea, going back to our framing of surprisal theory. I like to roughly frame surprisal theory in terms of saying that words are difficult to process because they're unpredictable. But this really highlights the fact that when I say unpredictable, what I actually mean is unpredictable to humans. Surprisal theory isn't talking about language models that we train over large corpora. It's talking about the predictive capacities of our brains. And what we're really making here is an assumption that the predictive capacities of our brains are well estimated by the neural language modeling task that we have. GPT-2 and these LSTMs are doing something similar to what the predictive functions of our brains are doing. And the probability distributions that we get out of them should be roughly equal. But the pitch that I like to make sometimes is that when we train language models, the only thing that they really care about is predicting the next word. That's the training objective that we give them. And we know from a lot of evidence that humans do word prediction as well. We predict upcoming words to facilitate efficient processing. But that word prediction is subservient to our ultimate goal of understanding sentences, building hierarchical syntactic structures, building semantic representations on top of that, and learning to understand the things that people are saying to us. And when we do understanding, the kinds of things that I like to think about as a person who does syntactic processing is that structure matters quite a bit when we interpret sentences. The way that we build syntactic structures for sentences, the ways that we parse sentences are very important in order to develop meaning, and they are useful to word prediction, but maybe less useful to machines doing next word prediction than they are to humans who have to build understanding. And so in some work that I did with a subset of the colleagues I've shown you before, I tried to disambiguate these two kinds of processing and break them out into two kinds of ways that we might find words and sentences surprising. Break surprisal theory into two parts. Is a particular word in a sentence surprising because of the sentence's structure, what I'm going to call syntactic surprisal? Or is a word just surprising in general, perhaps due to other factors? And the way I like to think about it is comparing a sentence like the newfound microbes word, something going onwards. You hear the word microbes in the sentence, and you might think that the word microbes is particularly surprising just because it's a very infrequent word. Of all the sentences in the English language, only a subset of biologists are probably going around talking about microbes. However, the word trying is a fairly frequent word in the English language. However, if you read a sentence like 3 girls trying to save up for a trip, trying turns out to look fairly surprising to people. But it's surprising not because the word is infrequent or rare, it's surprising because you're introducing more complex syntactic structure. We're not just talking about any 3 girls, we're talking about the particular 3 girls who are trying to save up for a trip. And introducing that additional clause causes some additional complexity. It's not that we've seen a rare word, it's that we've seen a rare structure, a more complex structure in our sentence. And so when we just feed a sentence like the suspect sent the file deserved into the black box of our language model and get a surprisal out, what we're really eliding over is the fact that somewhere in the internals of this language model, there are these multiple different kinds of predictability that are at play. Is a word unpredictable because it's rare, what I call lexical unpredictability, or is it because the syntactic structure, the sentence structure that's present there is rare, what I'm going to call syntactic predictability? And what our language models do is take those in addition to maybe some other factors and mush them all together, blend them all into a singular surprisal measure. And maybe for the particular task of language modeling, syntactic predictability is much less important than lexical predictability or some other factors. And so the syntactic predictability gets washed away. However, what I'm going to be doing in this project is trying to use some computational techniques in order to extract out of our language models a second measure that reflects strictly this kind of syntactic predictability so that we have 2 distinct measures, the surprisal measure that blends everything together and the syntactic surprisal measure that only indexes the structural properties of predictability. So then I can, by hand, blend in some extra syntactic surprisal when I'm predicting how much people slow down in their sentences, consistent with the hypothesis that humans upweight the syntactic surprisal relative to the models. Humans care more about structure than next word predictor models do, is the pitch of this project. And the way that I do that is kind of technical. I want to kind of gloss over all of the technical details here so I can get to the cool, exciting stuff. So feel free to stop me if this is the stuff that interests you. What I do is I train a kind of language model called an LSTM over a bunch of Wikipedia data. I also augment it with another corpus of data that's annotated with syntactic annotations. The particular annotations are from a framework called combinatorial categorical grammar, or CCG. So I don't really want to get into those technical details here. And what I end up doing is have the model predict both of these labels. First, predict the next word in the sentence, and then second, out of that same hidden representation, predict here, I adopt a conventional task within the NLP literature called CCG super tagging, that is predicting the syntactic role of a particular word within the structure. Here, predicting the syntactic role of the word file, the last word that I've seen. So predict the current word's syntactic role and the next word in the sentence. I take those probability distributions, and then I do some marginalization in order to construct this new probability distribution that I will refer to as our proxy for syntactic surprisal. The probability of the next word's syntactic role, the next word's CCG super tag, based on the previous words that I've seen. So how predictable is the upcoming syntactic structure, given what I've seen, doing some kind of marginalization, using all of the different things that I get out of this computational model that I've trained. And using that, I get this sort of chaotic plot of data. Each of these facets represents the predictions from this model for a different kind of garden path sentence. For simplicity, I'm going to cut out the other 2 kinds and only talk about the MVRR garden paths that we've been talking about so far. And I get 4 different predictions out of this model. One that uses both kinds of surprisals, the kinds of lexical surprisal, the surprisal that we've seen from previous slides, the syntactic surprisal that I've now constructed using that marginalization, as well as predicting reading times from both of those models versus a model that uses neither of those surprisals, those yellow dots from the last plot. In order to make this a little bit simpler to read, I'm going to only focus on one particular reason. There's this thing that happens with self-paced reading experiments where we get spillover effects and like to look at later words. But for our models here, our models aren't really subject to these spillover effects. So we'll only look at the disambiguating word. And I'm also going to particularly only look at our model that considers the blend that I've constructed between syntactic and lexical surprisal, a blend that is fit to the data versus only using the old surprisals from before. And what we find is that this green bar on the left that represents the blend I've constructed predicts larger garden path effects than this purple bar on the right. And so by making this blend, our hypothesis is borne out by allowing the model to upweight syntactic structural properties more than lexical properties. We are getting closer to those big effects that people have seen in the human data. But once we bring the human data into the equation, we've done better, but we're still so far from the actual empirical human reading times. Those light green bars on the right are so high that I couldn't show you this plot initially because you can't see the differences between any of the models. They're shoved against the x-axis. And part of the reason that I want to show you this in this larger pitch about quantitative modeling in order to build quantitative theories and collect this precise quantitative data is to talk about how we can move forward from finding that a particular quantitative implementation of a model, that is, if I go all the way back before this project, we see this data and we see that just using the surprisals from these language models doesn't quite work out. This doesn't mean that we reject the theory. This means that we have to, in some sense, steelman this theory, develop the theory further, because we've made a lot of assumptions about the quantitative relationship between the verbal theory that unpredictability in humans corresponds to slowdowns, and then claiming that that means exactly what these quantitative language models spit out is the same predictability. We make that assumption here, we see that it doesn't work out, and then we dig in further to the assumptions that we're making and find a way to make that quantitative link between the verbal theory and the data a little bit more precise to see what quantitative assumptions we need to make to get close to modeling the actual empirical data. And I'd love to say that that theory one that I showed you way at the beginning of this slide deck actually predicts these effects greater. But the problem is that we don't have a way to compare them because we don't have great quantitative implementations of what a reanalysis process looks like. In fact, a couple of my colleagues are actually working, a couple of my colleagues in different groups are working on trying to build quantitative models of what reanalysis might look like under different assumptions about the links between these reanalysis processes and the kinds of quantitative models that we have available to us. And then by testing those quantitatively, by seeing what assumptions we need to make, we can see if they can make better quantitative predictions than surprisal theory does, and start to disambiguate between which theories explain the data the best. Now, glancing at how much time we have left, I am accurate in saying that I talk too much, and I have a bunch of other slides on another project where we focus on the idea of building data sets that allow our models to work on them. Language models have all of these problems like we need vocabularies that are within our training sets, or models have good word embeddings to correspond to particular vocabulary items, which comes against the fact that psycholinguists love using fancy, fun vocabulary in order to make sure that we're not bored writing stimuli. And that kind of makes problems for quantitative modelers like me and my colleagues when all of the fancy vocabulary psycholinguists use don't show up in all of our fancy language models. And so this next project was sort of about doing high-end replications of some agreement attraction experiments and other psycholinguistic phenomena, but only using vocabulary in a restricted subset of data, particularly this corpus called the Pentrivik that has beautiful syntactic annotations in a variety of different styles, in order to facilitate the kind of computational modeling that allow us to model more complex, linguistically involved processes like some theories of reanalysis. But with that brief brush over that and a quick skip through a bunch of slides, see if there's anything else I'm missing, I want to leave some time for comments, questions, and discussions so I'm not talking the entire time. So I think I'll pause there.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh,
Here?
fantastic. You might ask a long question if you'd like to as well.
Sure. So about the second work you have done, so
Yes.
you make the model to predict two objective functions, right? One is CCG parsing, and the other one is next token prediction, right? And that
Yes.
leads to model to be similar to the human data, right? Maybe using the same takeaway, if we make the model to have, let's say, maybe 100 objective function, like do syntactic parsing, next token prediction, next sentence prediction, and maybe part of speech tagging, whatever, every kinds of like a linguistic tasks all together. Do you think that will reach out to the human data more? And the follow-up question is then, is that what really humans do? Because the data you collected is in the very not limited, but very experimental setup, right? You
Yes.
do some very particular task, and people pay attention on the task. So maybe that is a little more experimental rather than practical data. And I wonder, like, how having this multiple objectives in the NLP model may lead to more experimental data, or may more lead to the more practical data, and how does that different? How does that make it different? Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of very, very good, very exciting questions. So I'm going to try to keep in mind all of the parts of it. If I forget one of them, please let me know, because there's a lot of stuff that I can go off about here that's very exciting. So the first thing that I want to jump in on is like your idea of adding more and more tasks to train the models on. And I think that that really does fit with the pitch that I'm giving earlier, which is that what humans are actually after, if we want to think about humans in an optimization setting, what we're sort of optimizing for in some sense is understanding sentences, building those meaning structures when we do comprehension. And so it might make sense to stick on a bunch of tasks that have to do with that to see if they are going to build a model that can do better. And this actually brings me back to something that I worked on like very early in grad school, which was on a task called natural language inference, which I think has sort of lost favor recently, like NLI tasks and training on MNLI. And a very early thing that I was interested in there was in trying to see whether we can build good parsing models if we just train neural models on tasks associated with language understanding. And the reason that I bring this up is to sort of highlight the thing that I'm sort of like interested in concretely here, which is building a sort of like detailed model about what things exactly are important in order for a model to produce the same kinds of surprisal patterns, reading patterns, or so on that we observe. And so the kind of pitch that I'm making in this paper, I framed as like a focus on understanding, but it's sort of translated that into a focus on syntactic structure as something that's more important in humans than in models. And so I would be very excited by work that does a sort of like kitchen sink approach to tasks to train on in like this vast multitask setting, and then does some exploratory work interested in exactly what kinds of tasks make models better at predicting human data versus worse at predicting human data. If I had quite a bit more compute than I have right now, and quite a bit of time to work on that, that's something that I'd be like very excited about doing. And if someone wants to do that, I'd be very excited in seeing the data. So yes, on widespread multitask learning, I think that would be really cool and really interesting. Another thing that you mentioned was about the constrained task settings that we have. When we collect human data, we have people in a lab, we have them read these isolated sentences in a contextless way, and we make them hit the space bar, moving from word to word. It's not an extraordinarily naturalistic way to do reading. One thing that gives me confidence that this does reflect some naturalistic processes is the fact that a lot of the findings that you get in these kinds of laboratory self-paced reading experiments replicate in variants of this task that are a little bit more naturalistic. A lot of the findings that you see in these kinds of experiments translate to findings in eye tracking experiments, where it's unnatural because you're in a lab and you're sticking your face into this big machine, but you are just reading sentences, paragraphs, pages on a computer screen the same way you'd read anything else. And it turns out that eye tracking data tends to corroborate findings in self-paced reading fairly well. And in the future, we'd be able to test this more explicitly because I showed you a part of the syntactic ambiguity processing benchmark, the self-paced reading version of the data. We actually recently just finished collecting a large eye tracking corpus to go along with it that we're going to be presenting around and releasing in the near future. So that data will exist, so we can see these kinds of results in a slightly more naturalistic setting. The other kind of results that I wanted to point to is work that another set of colleagues of mine do sometimes is instead of showing people the sort of weird garden path sentences that I've been showing people, they take naturalistic text. A couple of common examples are, there's this corpus called the Natural Stories corpus, which is just a bunch of like children's fairy tales. There's also a lot of work that's been done on a particular chapter of Alice in Wonderland, where you get people doing eye tracking or self-paced reading experiments, reading naturalistic text, measuring their reading times, and using measures like surprisal to see how well surprisal estimates their reading over those naturalistic corpora. And what we find is that this is a space where surprisal does maybe not surprisingly well, where you get very high correlations between the surprisal's language models put out and the kinds of naturalistic reading that people do in those settings. And so it's actually when we give people these kinds of weird, trickier sentences, when we sort of test the limits of the human processor, that these surprisal models tend to work a little bit worse. But those happen to be the places where psycholinguists are interested in because they also tell us the most about how the processor might work. There are a lot of ways to read a sentence well, but to read sentences poorly in the same way as humans will convince us that the models might be doing something like what humans do. Do those answer questions? I want to make sure I cover that before I jump over to Randy.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, thanks for all the answers. I think I think one of my students is also collecting eye tracking data sets. So maybe you should talk to her. I mean, Karen. Yeah. So yeah,
was the presentation 2 weeks ago?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, that was great. Sorry, I didn't give you any comments then, but if you want to meet, I'd love to meet and chat.
Yes, that would be great. I'll send you an email later today.
Fantastic.
Can I just ask one more follow-up question? Sorry, I'm gonna make it quick.
Sure, certainly.
So I have another student working on detecting discourse patterns between human written text and AI written text. And nowadays, we see some typical like lexicons written by AI models, like a commendable or like a delve into. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw the Twitter discussion on delve recently.
Yeah. So, do you see this surpriser effects can be also affected to humans to see the AI written text? And then some words like or some phrases or some discourse patterns make humans surprised rather than you know what I mean? Like
Yeah. So
Yeah.
one thing I want to mention is this is going to seem slightly unrelated, but I think I see a connection between the kinds of things that you've been seeing and a bit of work that's been happening within this space. A couple of like computational psycholinguistics folks have recently been interested in a question that's practically useful for me, which is what kinds of language models are best at predicting human data? Because we check like LSTMs and GPT-2, and we have some work looking at like more recent, fancier models. But the reason that we're sort of comfortable just looking at like GPT-2 as far as transformer models go is because there's a fair amount of work that's begun to show that the sort of increasingly better language models that exist, like GPT-3 and GPT-4, actually do worse than like GPT-2. And when I say GPT-2, I actually mean here GPT-2 small, because it turns out that even the larger GPT-2 models are actually worse at predicting human behavior than GPT-2 small. And so there is something that people are observing, that as language models get like really, really good at the task of language models, one way that people phrase this is that they've become too good. Surprisals have become too low. They've become so optimized that they've sort of like outpaced humans at the task of next word prediction, which I think gives me confidence in my take that maybe next word prediction isn't super high on the priorities of things that humans do. It just tends to be a good way to measure what people do in terms of bottlenecks and surprisal theory. Surprisal theory doesn't depend on us being the best at doing it, just that we're sufficiently good. And so I think that there is like this sort of alignment between these models have become so good at next word prediction that the predictions that they're making have started to become weird for humans, which leads there to be things that humans can detect as unnatural and too probable relative to the sort of more random productions one can say that humans might make given their probability distributions.
Wow, that's very interesting insight. Thanks for sharing it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Very cool work you're doing. I'd love to hear more about that. Sorry, Randy, I've been making you wait.
Oh, no problem. I'm not even sure if this is an interesting question or a nothing burger, but at the beginning of your talk, you said you're interested in finding out why people process sentences the way they do. And I had a big surprisal score to the word why. I expected you to say how. I'm a psychologist. And I just wonder if that is a meaningful distinction to you.
Yeah, so it is somewhat meaningful to me, but I feel like I might use these terms in a way that's slightly unorthodox, which is that I sort of think about why, how distinctions to separate in my mind differences in different kinds of theories. So I think about this in terms of like MAR levels a lot of the time, where I like to distinguish the sort of like very high level computational theory building that goes on in spaces like with surprisal theory, where the claim is very much that humans do predictive processing and difficulty is downstream of predictive processing. This seems to be like a very good sort of why explanation to me. Why do people slow down here? Because their predictive processing tells them that this is unlikely and they have to spend a lot of time. Now, exactly how that happens, for me, suggests a more like algorithmic, lower level explanation. And those are things that I should say I'm also very interested and very excited in finding out about. But I didn't think about it explicitly when beginning the talk, but maybe I was primed by the fact that the theory I'm talking about is surprisal theory, which I think about as very much a why explanation in search of later on a more concrete, like mechanistic explanation of exactly how these probabilities are updated or computed, because we can assume that we do it in like some optimal Bayesian way, but that might be like a very optimistic view of how optimal our next word prediction is. And so delving into the more details would be more how to me. But again, this is probably very idiosyncratic to the way my brain processes these distinctions.
Another distinction that might be relevant is one that Chomsky made between theories that are descriptively adequate and theories that have explanatory adequacy. And where do you see yourself working in that respect?
Descriptive versus, yeah. So I think that as far as like in the Chomsky sense of things, I have a lot of colleagues that have collaborated on a lot of projects that sort of attempt to get to explanatory adequacy. My understanding of the Chomsky distinction is like very in tune to the sort of how did language capacities emerge question, which is very focused on learning, which is something that is maybe a little bit distinct from the kinds of questions that I'm most interested in asking. There are a lot of like exciting bits of work, some of which I've collaborated on, which sort of ask the question of how did the syntactic processing capabilities in humans emerge given the constraints that are around? Explain how this mechanism has existed, which is how I understand the Chomsky distinction. But despite the fact that my goals are very much to build models that are very much only explanatory in the sense that they explain like full adult comprehension and production rather than development, I think there is a flavor of explanatory that I am hoping to achieve. But maybe a more contentious take that I have is that I see descriptive modeling as a stepping stone towards a more explanatory account. That I might not be the most zealous advocate of surprisal theory in the field, but I do think that if surprisal theory turns out to be a good theory, then it can be developed into something that might be more satisfactorily like explanatory. Does that sort of make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Anyway, I loved your talk today. I hope that it will keep seeing you here and that over time this group can sway you to the dark discourse side of the psycholinguistic force.
As an early career faculty member looking at new directions for my research to take, I will admit that I am maybe more swayable than I ever have been at any other point. But yeah, as long as it fits into my schedule, this seems like a wonderful space. You've been asking super excellent questions, and I'd love to hang around as much as I can. I realize we're a little bit, maybe more than a little bit over, so I don't want to keep folks, but I'm happy to answer any more questions if there are any.
You have a quick one or?
I have kind of a quick
Okay, cool.
question or consideration.
Yeah.
Especially in the terms of like how or why. Because I'm also interested in this idea that like what's the minimal amount of information we can use to convey the most amount of meaning or the correct interpretation, rather. So like when I hear about this stuff, I'm thinking about like how humans like utilize or incorporate like temporal information into like guiding their interpretations of stuff. I'm wondering if like if you instead made like how do I put this? If you gave like instructions directed toward like a task, whether that would inform how people utilize like sorry, let me rephrase. If you have like an instruction-based task where people are trying to perform a certain action and you include ambiguous language and disambiguous language, like what kind of effects would you expect to see at the other end of like the outcome of that task? And I guess if you put like a time constraint on it, like what kind of interpretations of the instructions would you get? I know that's kind of like far-fetched and outside of the scope of this, but like it does speak to something of like the utility of like how people ambiguate or disambiguate certain words in certain contexts, I think at least.
Yeah, that's interesting. Introducing a context where people have to perform some specific task. I guess the task that we have here in these experiments is that we threaten participants that we're going to ask them a bunch of comprehension questions at the end of sentences. And so we like to believe that that means that participants are reading these sentences and trying to fully understand them. But I do see something very interesting about forcing people to like act like in some like more agentive way, giving them instructions to like choose a specific object in a reference frame or something, and how that decision-making task will change the way that they disambiguate. I don't know if anything on the garden path sentence is related to this, but it does remind me of a lot of work on this framework that's sort of a little bit more discoursey and a little bit more pragmatically called the Rational Speech Acts, which is about how people, the sort of like task framing is that people will have an array of objects and they'll ask you questions that are potentially ambiguous about which object to click on. It's usually like shapes with colors, and then people will sometimes describe the object in a way that could be ambiguous between two options. And the way that it's typically framed is that under the assumption that speakers are maximally rational, and the only time that they'd choose an ambiguous statement is if there were a better, more efficient way of describing one of the two objects that are ambiguous between. And so a rational reasoner would be like, well, if they could have described that one of the ambiguous choices more efficiently, and they chose to be a little bit more inefficient, then I must select this object. And so there is like some psycholinguistic evidence that people do engage in this sort of like rational reasoning in order to sort of handle disambiguation. How that translates into a more garden path context, I don't know of any work doing that, but I'd be very interested in the kinds of ideas you have for like what kinds of tasks and what kinds of effects you might expect to see, how people might process ambiguity differently under these constraints. It sounds very exciting.
Thank you so much. Right, I guess we should wrap it up. But thanks again for the wonderful talk. That was very insightful. Yeah, let's give it a applause.
Yeah. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience.
All right, I guess we'll resume in 2 weeks' time. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good weekend.